Welcome everybody to another episode of the Scotland Stoics. My name is Robert Keenan and I will be one of your presenters today, where we bring ancient philosophy to modern ears, and hopefully you'll find a wee bit of inner, I was wanting to say it in the Braveheart tune there, freedom. So good, thanks for coming on, good to see everybody. Do you want to introduce yourself, Colin?
Hi, I'm Colin. I'm Bob's co-host, and I'll be doing as I'm told in this episode of the Scotland Stoics podcast. It's great to have William Irvine with us as our guest this evening in Scotland. I'm not sure what time it is where you are, William, or is it Bill? What do you prefer?
I'm Bill
Bill.
to my friends. It's afternoon here, and it's a rather pleasant October afternoon.
Great. Good to hear that. Good to hear you've got some nice weather in the States. Back to you, Bob.
Yep, so just a wee update, Colin, just to let you know that there's only now 10 days to go to the big one.
What's that?
The game, the only game in town. Sorry, Bill, for keeping you out the loop here. There's a massive soccer game that we call it here in Scotland between the two biggest rivals, the Glasgow Celtic versus Glasgow Rangers. So as in ancient Rome, it was always the Greens versus the Blues. Well, it's the same over here. Big, massive rivalry. So I'm looking forward to that. But enough of that talk.
Yep.
Enough of that talk. Let's start getting a wee bit about philosophy. But before we do that, Bill, what we do in this podcast, which is slightly different, we get to know our guest a little bit before we start talking about philosophy. So could you let our listeners know a wee bit about where you grew up?
I had a rather traveling childhood. My father was construction engineer for Anaconda Copper Company. So I grew up in northern Minnesota. I grew up in Montana. I grew up in Nevada. I spent my first 2 years in school in Chile, in South America. But mostly, small places, small towns, and that worked for me. So, if I'd grown up in a big city, different country, whatever, probably would have been a different person as a result.
Yeah, it's interesting. Can you give the listeners a wee bit about you? Obviously, you travelled a lot. So, what was your childhood experiences like growing up?
Well, in Chile, I was just writing about this actually. I lived literally across the street from the Pacific Ocean. So if I went out my front door and walked across the street and then walked about 20 yards more, there was ocean, but I would have been 6 years old at the time. So for me, that wasn't weird. That's just what's across the street. And there was also, I remember one occasion. Chile, that it's back then, this would have been in 1959. There was affluence, but there was extreme poverty as well. And I remember leaving my house to go to the American school, and outside the door were two children my age eating out of my garbage can. It's one of those memories that you realize it's just an accident of birth, or our places could have been reversed. Other than that, in Nevada, in Montana, I had what now, I don't know if you in Scotland have the same expression, but in America we call it a free range childhood. So I would go out and play with my friends all day long. I just had to be home for dinner. And so kids played with kids with no adult supervision. And it's just the way it worked. And I think now a lot fewer children are in situations where they play in an unsupervised manner. And you can hear people telling stories, people my age, about how when they were kids, they would go into New York City. They would take the subway by themselves into New York City, and now it's sort of like, oh, you could be arrested if if a parent let a kid do that. But those were different days. And I kind of wonder, what effect has that had on, people who are now coming into adulthood? If you're a kid playing with other kids and there's no adults around, you have to learn how to work it out for yourself. But if there's always a grown-up where you can go to and say, so-and-so said something mean, do something about that, then you lack those skills. And those would be skills, I think, that a Stoic would really want to develop in a human being. That is the ability to respond to life's stresses and not feel the need to go running off and find somebody to do it for you.
No, that's very interesting. I agree with that. I think too many kids today are wrapped up in cotton wool. You need to learn from experiences, not just positive, but negative ones too. So, no, that's a great answer. Tell us a little bit about your listeners about your academic progress. Obviously, currently you're a professor, but can you tell us a wee?
Let's see. Okay. Let's see. Went off to what you guys call university. We call it college. University of Michigan, and majored. Started out in physics, but with a background interest in philosophy. Found out physics is really, really hard. So switched to philosophy major. Then was told there are no jobs in philosophy. And in conjunction with my physics, I had been taking lots of mathematics. So I figured that what I would do is I would get a double major in mathematics and physics. And that way, in mathematics and philosophy. And that way, if the philosophy thing didn't work out, I could bill myself as a mathematician. Because, there are a lot of employers who, if they see that you have a philosophy major, they're going to think that you're going to spend your day, staring at your own hand saying, is this hand a human hand? But if you bill yourself as a math major, then they're going to say, well, this guy can probably get the job done. And the interesting thing is, as a philosophy major, this would have been in the early 1970s, we had a very, very strong philosophy department there, nationally ranked philosophy department. But the only place I encountered the Stoics was in the logic classes that I took. Because, of course, the Stoics were some of the preeminent logicians of their time. They invented the inference rule modus ponens. If P, then Q, P, therefore Q. Basic, but there was a time when people didn't realize that. And they did realize that. But they didn't really push the idea of developing a philosophy of life. And I think if I'd asked one of my professors, what's your philosophy of life? They just would have given me a curious look. Well, I want to have a good job and maybe get a good car and all of that. No. But what is the big agenda? What's the grand goal? Well, like I told you, I want to have a good job and get a good car. So, and that's changed, in the current environment. Now, there are a lot more philosophers who are interested in Stoicism, and in many colleges you could go and you could take a class in Stoicism. I ended up teaching at Wright State University, which is a public university in Dayton, Ohio. And for instance, in my university, you can take not only a course that talks about Stoicism, but a course in Stoicism. And I know that because I teach that course. So it's changed dramatically. And I think it's changed for the better.
No, it's absolutely fantastic. Colin, have you got a question to ask Bill just now?
Yeah, you speak about teaching a course in Stoicism. How long did it take you to come up with that course? Was it, first time through, it worked really well, or has it been evolving since you started teaching that, or is it pretty set now?
Everything evolves. It's truly amazing how I start out with an idea, and then you realize the idea kind of has a life of its own. I find that with the things that I write, I have to come repeatedly write them. You just have to have projects lurking in the background, because what happens is you write them and it sounds brilliant. You look at them the next day and you think, this is so terrible. This is awful. But if you work on it every day, what you do is you bring the muses, about the muses, this notion that there are these gods that that will visit you and give you great stuff, give you musical talent or make you a better artist or whatever. I'm convinced that they exist. And I'm also convinced that if they ever cut me off, I would be doomed as a creative person. I'll be doing something completely different. I'll have a project or two in the background. I'll be doing something completely different. And then suddenly, this idea will come to me. I don't know where, but there it is. And if those ideas ever stopped, I'm doomed, because otherwise it's just the pain without the reward. So Stoicism, I only found out I was going to be a Stoic, 15, 16, 18 years ago. And that was a surprise. And then realized, so that was when I was working on a book called On Desire, which was, I think it appeared in 2006. But I went into that as a result of a kind of midlife crisis. And I decided that maybe part of the solution was to become a Zen Buddhist. But I'm an academic and I get promoted and paid depending on what kind of publications I do. And I spotted in this a golden opportunity to do what we in the States call a twofer, and that is two for the price of one. Because what I could do is do the research that I was interested in doing anyway in order to become a Zen Buddhist. And I could get a book out of it, which would count as a publication, which would be a really good thing. So I embarked on this, but for completeness, Zen Buddhists give us one philosophy of life. And to be complete, I had to explore alternative philosophies of life and came across the Stoics. And then before long realized that in a curious kind of way, the Zen Buddhists and the Stoics had very similar psychological insights. How they differed is their strategies for attaining a kind of tranquility. So if you're a Zen Buddhist, what do? You sit around and you meditate. You solve koans. There's a whole bunch of things you do. And as far as I know, that works. Stoics, no, none of that. Marcus Aurelius wrote the Meditations, but they weren't meditations in the sense that Zen meditations are meditations. They're simply thoughts about things. I realized that Stoics were headed in the same direction and yet had a so much lower cost of admission. And to be a practicing Stoic, let's see, do you have to sit and meditate for decades? No. What do you have to do? Well, you kind of do a little bit of research, try a few Stoic exercises out, like one of them is negative visualization. Oftentimes when I have an audience to work with, one of the first things we'll do is we'll do an exercise in negative visualization, and that's where you imagine losing something that you have and probably take for granted. It could be your car, it could be your house, it could be your children. And then you just have that negative thought for a few moments and then you get back to life. So that'd be an example of a Stoic strategy. And what I tell people is in a matter of days, you can learn enough about Stoic psychological strategies and you can use them in your own life that you will know whether Stoicism is working for you or not. It's not going to take decades waiting for your moment of enlightenment. It's going to take a long weekend, a week at the most, and you'll know one way or another. And you will be no poorer for having made the attempt. So it's really nifty. So I gave it a try. And I realized not only that it worked for me, but that I was what I call a congenital Stoic. And that is through my life, I've been using Stoic strategies, but in a low grade and kind of awkward fashion. And reading the Stoics, I was able to fine tune those strategies and really put them to work in my life.
Great. I think you're right there. It's easy to access Stoicism with the respect that it's quite quick. Over a few days, you can notice in yourself that there's a change. I guess we've got Stoic Week coming up this month, where any of our listeners that haven't tried any of the Stoic techniques or looked at Stoicism in any detail can check that out, and they can find that out on the Scotland Stoics Facebook page. There's a link there to that. You can sign up for free. It's a week long, and you may get a lot out of that. It might change your life.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much. Right, Bob.
No, I was just wanting, can you add to that, Bill? Because you actually started answering my question. You says in the Guide to the Good Life, and first and foremost, I'd like to thank you for writing that book. That was the first book I read on Stoicism, and it totally revolutionised my outlook in life. You know what I mean? So thanks for that.
Oh, good. You're welcome.
And one of the things he says when I was researching it again, I've obviously, because I knew you were coming on, I started reading the book again. I was listening through audio, and you did say that the most valuable technique in the Stoic psychological toolkit is negative visualization. Now, I know you spoke about it there, but why do you think it's the most valuable? Because some people think journaling's the most valuable. Other people say the view from above. But I was really keen as to why you felt that was the strongest psychological toolkit.
It's powerful, and the thing is that most of us take the things that are most important to us for granted, and it's an insidious process. But you work really hard to get something, you get it, and then if you're a normal human being, the first thing you do is you say, okay, I've got that one in the bag. Oh, you know what? There's something else that would be even better. And then so you start pursuing that, and you take the thing you worked for granted. There are so many people in life who are chasing mirages. Out on the desert, you're thirsty and it's hot, and you look off there and the sand's shimmering. There's water, a pool of water, and you hike for miles and miles in the hot desert sun. And when you arrive, the water's gone, right? Because it was just a mirage. And that's what people do with their goals in life. So there's this thing that I call the gap theory of happiness. Why are people unhappy? It's because there's a gap between what they have and what they want. What they have is here. What they want is here. Okay. So how do they close the gap? Well, they change things so that what they have is equal to what they want. Problem is that as soon as that happens, okay, there's happiness for a while, and then whoops, what they want rises again. And so they're no better off because there's the gap. There's the gap. Stoics and Zen Buddhists both had this incredible insight, namely that there's another way to close the gap. Instead of getting what you want, you can want what you've already got, which is obvious once you've heard it, and yet look at the billions of people who haven't figured it out. And yet look back in intellectual history, there have been any number of people who have figured it out. The Zen Buddhists, for instance, figured it out. Then it becomes a psychological question of, okay, so how can you want what you already have? And negative visualization is one really quick and easy way to do that. So what do? Hey, take something you have and imagine its absence for your life. And then what'll happen is you'll realize, gosh, I'm really lucky to have that. And I ought to embrace that. And I ought to embrace the life that I'm living, because the life I'm living could be worse. And then what you get is a takeaway glow from that experience. There's going to be a period of time where you stop taking it for granted. And it's a wonderful thing. Guess what? It's going to wear off, though. And in a passage of time, hours, days, you're going to start taking it for granted again. But the beauty of it is this negative visualization is like, if you went to a doctor with a rash, and he gave you this cream, and then you read the instructions on it, and on the cream, it said apply as needed. Okay, well, you can do that with negative visualization. So as soon as you realize, gosh, I'm taking for granted the very thing that I just got over taking for granted, then what do? Try some more negative visualization. In the course of a day, I might do multiple episodes of negative visualization, and it's a small little thing. It's easy to do. Takes what, 10 seconds to do. and you can do it, and no one knows that you're doing it because you're just there doing it in your own mind. So you don't have to put on robes, assume a seated posture, start burning an incense candle. And if you do those sorts of things, I'm not putting that down. That's just another path to get where you want to go. So running joke in my family. So I've got grown children. I've got a wife, and oftentimes she'll know that I've been negatively visualizing because she'll hear me yell out from my back office where I am now. She'll hear me yell out, "Hey, thanks for existing." And then she knows I have just visualized her being absent from my life. And then, you realize instantly, wow, that would be a disaster. And yet she's here. And isn't that just absolutely wonderful?
Mhm. I was just smiling at that comment there as you were speaking. My son came in trying to ask me something. I'm like,
Okay. Okay.
But I don't mean it. I don't mean it. I love it to death. It's just,
yeah, I do lots of podcasts. Usually it's a dog. More often it's a cat. But of sons and children, that they work just as well.
Absolutely. He just ran in, but no, he's okay. He's away again. No, that honestly, Paul, that was a great explanation. Thanks a lot for that. So Colin, do you want to come back into that? Yeah.
Yeah. Bill, what triggers you to go through negative visualization, or is it just a habit that you've built up over time that you think, you know what, I've got a minute here, let me have a wee thought about something that would be a disaster if it was to happen, or something that would upset me? What makes you go there, and how do you remember to do that?
It becomes a habit. It's like brushing your teeth. You just do it, and you start doing it, and then so there is no schedule. I guess you could probably have an app that reminds you. Little happy song goes off and says time to negatively visualize. Maybe such an app exists. I don't know, but and periodically, and almost there's another kind of related exercise you can do, and I call it the last time exercise, where whatever it is you're doing, you pause to reflect on, number one, the fact that there will be a last time that you do it. And then you reflect on the possibility that this is that last time. And it can transform almost anything you do from just something you take for granted and you're on autopilot and you go through the motions to a very special kind of case. I mean, suppose you had a friend and you realized that this was the last time you were going to see them because they were going away on a long trip, or maybe they had joined the army and were going off to some dangerous situation. It transforms relationships in an incredible way. It's one of those things that forces you to be in the moment, because so much of your life you're not in the moment. So much of your life your mind is wandering. You're thinking about the past, you're thinking about the future, but you're not thinking about now. But the last time meditation can drag you into the present moment and keep you there for a while. It's really a remarkably strange feeling when that happens. You're so alive. But then it's like we saw with negative visualization. Give yourself some time and you will either drift back into the past or you'll drift forward into the future. But like I said, you can apply as needed. So it's easy. It's easy to do. That was the beautiful thing for me about Stoicism. It's a low-cost philosophy in the sense of learning it is very easy to do. Using it is very easy to do. And it's just surprising that more people don't do it. In part, that's because they don't know about it.
Thanks for that.
Sure.
Thank you.
Moving on, so you mentioned the muses earlier in your creative process. I'm still waiting for that musical muse to come to me, tell you. But when I was obviously, I'm like Bob. Your book, Guide to the Good Life, is the first Stoic book I picked up, and like him, I was like, I'm hooked here. This is for me. But I hadn't realised you'd written a series of other books. Just correct me if I'm wrong here. You get 2 books in Stoicism and 7 books in total. Is that right?
Well, it depends on what you count as a book.
Okay.
So it gets a little bit tricky. There are actually 3 books on Stoicism. So the one that people typically, well, Guide to the Good Life is the one. It came out in 2008. Got off to a slow start, but has been just enjoying wonderful sales ever since then. I thought. Now I've just been writing about this, so let me tell you something that your listeners might be interested in hearing. That is that right now we are in the midst of a Stoic renaissance. It's truly incredible. When I wrote on Desire. That was the book in which I kind of explored Zen Buddhism, but came out the other end. A Stoic, that was published in 2006. And then as a result of that, I thought I owed it to mankind. I had a Stoic duty to tell the world what Stoicism was about, because it had made such a difference in my life. Maybe it could make a similar difference in the lives of other people. So I decided I was going to write a book on Stoicism. That's the book that became Guide to the Good Life. But as I did so, I looked at the market for Stoic books. Okay, so when you're trying to get a book published, you have to convince a would-be you write what's called a proposal, and you have to convince a would-be publisher of a few things. Number one, that you're capable of writing the book you claim you're going to write. You have to have a track record. You have to have the credentials. And number two, that there's a market for the book. And so I did a search for, okay, so how many Stoic books are there? Because if there's a fair number, that proves the existence of a market. But there weren't very many at all. And I thought, I've got to write this book because I owe it to my Stoic predecessors to write this book. And yet it's going to be a difficult sell. And I thought, if I can get this sold, if I can get a publisher to take this, I will have pulled off a fast one. Because there's a good chance that if this book does get published, it might sell maybe a dozen copies. And half of those would be bought by my friends who might or might not actually read them, right? So I'm working on another project here. And in conjunction with that project, I did an Amazon search of books on Stoicism, because you can kind of time travel. So I went back to before 2008. And so it's an advanced search on Amazon if anybody wants to give this a try. First, you go to their book section, and then this little advanced search thing will pop up. So I asked Amazon, okay, how many books that have either Stoicism or Stoic in their title were published, that you carry, were published before 2008? And now it gets a little bit tricky because there's some double counting of books and so on, but there were 100 books total. And many of those were books actually written by the ancient Stoics that were still in print. Some of those, many of them were also scholarly works where you had scholars who were working to gain tenure and get promoted, who wrote books so other scholars could read them. So those scholars could write their own replies to those books. It's kind of like this endless game. And then there were only a handful of books that attempted to show a general audience what Stoicism was about. Only a handful. So I did the same search, only instead of doing it for before 2008, I did it for last month. That is in September. And I asked, okay, in September, how many books were published that have either Stoicism or Stoic in their title? And I got about 50 books published that month alone. So now books are coming out at more than the rate of one per day. Now, a lot of those books are self-published. And you had started this out by asking me how many books have I published. And so one of the things is I've self-published 2 books. One is a book on rowing, more precisely on sculling, where you're in this long, really tippy boat, but you go really fast. Just because I wanted to, And the other, Cynthia King, the classicist, she and I agreed that what the world needed was an updated translation of the writings of Musonius Rufus. And the one that existed dated back to 1947, and we decided, that she said thought she could do better. And we approached many reputable publishers, including the people who had published Guide to the Good Life, and to say, there's a market for this, and you should get into this, and couldn't find anybody. So simply decided, well, I'm gonna publish it. I'm gonna act as editor and publisher, and then Cynthia King, of course, will be the translator, because I don't know Greek and Latin. So we did that, self-published on CreateSpace. That's Amazon's publishing site, and it has done quite well since then. Now, here's the interesting thing: if you publish with a real publisher, depending on the contract, you might get to keep 10 or 15% of the total sales. But if you publish on CreateSpace, you get to keep more than half of the sales numbers. So is this a great universe or what? So we published it. It sold well since then. Cynthia is absolutely blown away, because she had done one book before that. And so in a typical 6-month period, the check I will give her vastly exceeds the total returns from the previous book she had done. So, okay, so I've got, I don't know, it's depending on how you count them, 8 to 10. And I'm currently working on a few different projects. So we'll see how that comes out.
Cool. Which of the books that you've written did you find the creative process most challenging, and why was that?
By the way, before I answer that, let me interject. So I've actually got 3 Stoic books. So the first was Guide to the Good Life. But then I said I had expected that not to do well. I had expected, but then I had a follow-up book that I thought would just do really terrifically well. And that's the book A Slap in the Face. So what that is basically a Stoic analysis of insults and how people should respond to insults. And that did really poorly. And one thing I discovered is that if you write a book on insults, people who review the book will use that as a chance to insult. I hadn't seen that coming, and that was a rookie error, if ever there was one. I think the book still stands up, and I think now that we're in an age where people are talking about outlawing hate speech, and people talking about microaggressions and all these things, it's as relevant as others as ever has been. And I also think that, and then the third book was A Stoic Challenge, which just came out about a year ago. Now, remind me, what was the question that I interrupted you when you were asking?
It's
the Stoic, the muses.
I was getting the creative muses. Which book did you find the creative process most challenging in, and why was that the case?
They're all challenging, and here's what makes them challenging. I kind of long had this delusion that what happens is the muses are just looking around at writers, and they look at you and say, "No, that's my man," and then they come down and start doing wonderful things for you and giving you material and slipping stuff under the door and so on. But the way it works is they will only help you if you work really hard. The work consists of, on a daily basis, grinding out stuff that the next day is going to look like garbage. You've got to sit there. You've got to do it. And if you do enough of that, then you'll get the notice of the muses, who will say, this guy's actually working really hard. I'm going to give him a little bit of help. And like I said, it's this weird thing where these ideas pop into your brain, where you're struggling with one part of something, And then the next day you wake up and the muse will say, you know, okay, I feel sorry for you. Here's what you need to do. You got those as 2 chapters. You need to merge those 2 chapters. And it's like, wow, you've just witnessed magic. Your muses, you have no idea how they work, but they're so much smarter than you are. And they will only help you if you work really hard. You talked about your own music muses, right? Same kind of thing, but a lot of people just sort of expect that the muse is going to come up like Santa Claus and say, okay, here's great stuff for you. I don't know why they don't work that way, but they don't work that way. So every project is challenging. Every project, I know how it feels now. And it feels hopeless while you're doing it. And yet, you know, you've got to go through the process if you want to get the input from the muses.
Great, thanks. That means when the pubs reopen and you're allowed to sing again, they'll be back up in the karaoke.
Yeah.
So every Friday night until I get signed up to a major record label. I think that's the way it's
Okay.
going to be for me.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, you're right though. You do need to put that effort in, and you do have to scrap a lot of what you've done or realign it or re-edit it and so on.
Yeah, you know, throwing away material is a good sign. I think it was Ernest Hemingway. This is a rough quotation. He said, the evidence that you have a great work is how much good stuff you can afford to throw away. And if you're throwing away good stuff, that's a very positive sign, because that means you've got even better stuff. And so you're kind of distilling this document down to the really great stuff. A lot of writers aren't going to do that, because that means they wasted a bunch of time if they're throwing away previous work. They wasted that time. Nope, it's part of the process. And it's a good sign that you're doing that, because you're saying, you know, I got a better way to do that.
Good way to look at it. Bob, you look really angry there, Bob. Have you got a question in anger?
Well, it's one thing we've not really brought up in the last few episodes at all. So it would be good to get your take on it, Bill. So on chapter 13 of The Good Life, you spoke about overcoming anger and saying it's the anti-joy. Could you let our listeners know why anger is seen as such a negative vein of light for the Stoics? And if you could maybe give us some examples, especially with Seneca.
Yeah, anger, and I have more to say about anger in Stoic Challenge. It's a really interesting emotion. So there are some negative emotions that really fascinate me. Envy is another one that really fascinates me, but anger is of interest because it's such a destructive emotion. And Seneca wrote one of his longer essays is on anger. And you read it and you just think, yep, he's figured this thing out. I still experience anger, and I'm still capable of becoming quickly angered, and I'm working on it, but it means I'm a human being. That's what that means. But I remember my wife and I had this wonderful opportunity a few years back. We got to go to Morocco, and at one point we got to go out camping in the Sahara Desert, and just a really neat occasion. And I remember thinking there, okay, I'm here in the Sahara Desert, and look at the stars. You can see a zillion stars in the sky. And aren't I a lucky person? Went to bed, spent the whole night angry about some stupid thing that had happened a week before. And, you know, and what's really terrible about it is you're sitting there thinking, I am so stupid to be doing this. And yet you can't just make it go away. It's insidious. It waits until you're thinking about something else, and then it kind of pokes in and says, oh, remember what happened. Mm-hmm. So in Stoic Challenge, I give this bit of advice. I say, what you've got to do is you've got to nip it in the bud. And that is, I describe what I call the 5-second rule. So the one conventional idea of the 5-second rule is that if you drop something on the floor, it's okay to eat it if you pick it up within 5 seconds, if you leave it longer than that. And I think that isn't scientifically substantiated. But with anger, what you've got to do is you've got to reframe it as something else. Because once your anger is activated, it's going to stick around for a long time. And a long time can mean decades. I've known older people who had lost much of their memory, right? And yet they can tell you in great detail something bad that happened to them decades before. It sticks. So the trick is you nip it in the bud. So the very first thing, as soon as you realize that there is something that could give rise to anger, you're very quick to reframe it in other terms. And one of the frames, the central frame one is simply to laugh about it. That's the comedic frame. So Socrates went out on the streets of Athens and was he never really did mind his own business. He was always trying to engage in people, so he could ask them why questions. And of course, they wouldn't know the answers, but somebody boxed his ears, and that's something he could have gotten angry about, and it could have left emotional scars for years and years and years. But instead, he turned it into a joke. And he said, isn't it unfortunate how when you go out for a walk, they don't tell you ahead of time whether or not to wear a helmet, right? So it became an interesting kind of joke. And framing it that way, then suddenly it becomes really hard for anger to arise. Another framing, and this is kind of the central one that I'm using in Stoic Challenge, is you frame the event as a test by the Stoic gods. Okay, so we've been talking about the muses. Here's the interesting thing. I assumed that I was an agnostic, and yet I find myself routinely not only talking about these gods, but talking to them. Yes, I talk to my muses, but then I also have this whole notion, and it's a mental game I'm playing with myself, I suppose, but a very effective game, that there are these Stoic gods. And they're like these coaches. And what they want to do is make you strong. And so what they do is they give you these tests. So when you experience some kind of setback, you're being tested. And how do you, first of all, the test is going to be self-graded. So the Stoics aren't going to descend and say, that was a middling effort, it's self-graded, but you get a good grade if you did two things in response to the setback. And the first thing is, did you find a very good workaround for it, or the best workaround you could, given the circumstances, a solution to it? And the second is, did you stay calm and cool as you did that? Because if you got angry, oops, all bets are off. You failed that test. So it becomes part of the game. And that is, okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm reframing this as a test. One analogy I use is there's another frame you can put it in as a game frame. So I want you to imagine this. So you're walking across the park, just enjoying the sunshine. And then you decide to do a little bit of jogging. And as you're jogging, you hear somebody run up from behind and they tackle you to the ground. How should you respond? Well, most people would become very angry. They would become upset. They would become distraught. Now here, I have to be careful, because for you, football means soccer. In America, football means tackle football. But in America, it's really interesting, because you'll see somebody running with the ball and somebody runs up from behind them and tackles them. And will they call the police? Will they be angry? No, they're going to be enthusiastic, because in the game they're playing, they just ran extra yards, and that's a good thing. So they're going to be exuberant. Same thing when somebody challenges you in a way. I mean, an example is when somebody insults you. If you think in terms of, this is a kind of test, and to pass this test, I have to deflect it. Insults, one of the best ways to deal with an insult is to just ignore the insult. Just proceed as if nothing had happened. It's one of the most devastating ways of dealing with the insulter, because a lot of times the insulter will simply repeat the insult. And then you just say, yeah, I heard you the first time, and then just carry on as if nothing had happened. Or if you have your wits about you, you can mock the insulter. So in my Stoic class that I teach, so I get an opportunity to do this. So I'm telling them about insults, and they're saying, no, insults, they're really painful, and they can wreck your day. And I say, no, they're just noise. And then finally, I give them this challenge. I say, okay, I want you all to think of the worst insult that you could direct my way. It can be a curse word. It can be anything you want. I want you to get it in your mind, and then I give them a few seconds and I say, okay, is everybody ready? And then I say, because when I count to 3, I want you all to yell that insult at me. 1, 2, 3. And then comes the outburst, right, of insults. And it's typically like 30 people have hurled the worst insult that they can possibly can at me. And then I just stand there and say, just noise, okay? Now, there was one time when I tried this, and I had one really good student who waited an extra 2 seconds before he did his insult. And so the whole class had erupted in all sorts of stuff. He waited 2 seconds and he said, old man. And it's really interesting because he got in through my defenses there. I didn't get angry. I was amused more than that, but it is interesting. And, an individual insult from a person that you have a deep relationship with can still sting. But in a lot of cases, the people who insult you are like barking dogs. And if you let a barking dog ruin your day, you're to blame. The dog isn't to blame because the dog, that's what dogs do. They bark. So if you think of human insulters in the same terms, it helps you deal with that.
No, I think it's an excellent explanation. And Stoicism shows us we'll get power over our judgment. So if we don't attach a judgment to that insult, then we can't get offended by it.
Yes.
It's really, really good. Really good answer.
And I know Bob's going to get angry at the football in a couple of weeks, and his team will get angry as well. But it'll be a test, Bob, to stay in second place, won't it?
Yeah. No, I think if my team wins, it'll be a preferred indifference. A big rivalry over here, Bill. That's what it is. I've probably got two good questions to finish off with you, right? So if you've got time to answer them, that'd be great. So in the Stoic Challenge, you gave examples of a number of people who overcame many obstacles in their lives through determination and resilience. Can you give a listener some examples of their experiences, especially people you spoke about in the book?
Yeah, so I had all sorts of cases of people. So most people say, I've had a difficult life. I have setbacks. And one way Stoics said you can reframe that and you can put it into a broader geographical or historical prospect. And then you realize whatever life you're living is in fact the dream life of somebody else. And it's strange because you might have your own idea of a dream life of your favorite soccer star, right? If you could be living his life, then at last you'd be happy. And whether you realize it or not, right now there's somebody dreaming that they could be living your life. So it's this strange chain of dreams that results in massive amounts of human dissatisfaction. So one of the things you can do is put yourself in the shoes of one of these other people. And so I tell the story of his last name is Bauby, and he's a French editor, literary person, and he had this stroke in his brainstem, so bottom of his brain, which basically cuts off all brain flow to and from his body. So he was completely paralyzed and could do two things. He could blink his left eye, and he could slowly turn his head. Because he couldn't blink his right eye, they had to sew it shut. Otherwise, it would dry out and ulcerate, and that would be terrible. So imagine going through life with one left eye you could blink with, and being able to slowly turn your head. And that's what you've got to work with. How about eating? Well, they would use a tube to do that. I'm not going to get too detailed here, but just imagine that life. Now imagine your life. You can do so much. And you can do it without even thinking twice. If you want to, you can get up and walk in the other room. For him, that would be a dream existence. But in a lot of these cases, there also comes out the notion of courage, the courage these people show under their circumstances. So he succeeded in doing, in writing his memoir. And then the question is, well, how can he do that if you can only blink your left eye? And the answer was, he came up with a code. He and the people who were taking care of him came up with a code. And by blinking, he could actually dictate. And now I imagine, when I'm at my word processor, I'm tapping away, at 60 words a minute. And when I make a mistake, I back up and so on. But for him, that, editing, even getting the words out in the first place is challenging. Editing is really difficult. And yet he did it. See, that's the thing. He rose to the challenge. And that's what courage is. We think of courageous people. What do? They jump into giant waves and go out and rescue a baby who got washed out to sea. Yeah, that's courage. But taking a challenge, a really deep challenge, and finding the inner strength to do it, that's a very important kind of courage as well. And the Stoics valued both kinds of courage and thought one of the things you should do is develop that courage in yourself. So you are a passionate fan of soccer, I take it from the conversation here. And it's really interesting. I'm capable of watching sports, but I don't actually watch a lot of them, but I do them. So I mentioned that I wrote a book on sculling, on rowing, and I'm a competitive rower because I call it Stoic training. So what am I doing? I'm doing something hard just because it's hard. I'm doing something that's causing me discomfort just so I can expand my comfort zone. I'm doing something where there's a possibility of failure. How come? Because so I can fail and I can realize, the trick is not to avoid failure, but the trick is to be able to rebound. You bounce, you learn to bounce instead of breaking. So watching sports has been displaced in my life with doing sports. I don't do them well. And in particular, I'm not well suited to rowing. I have the wrong body type. You can go through the whole list of things. And yeah, it's interesting because it's companionship, and it's a test, and there is a level of courage, lowercase c courage, but courage that comes with it. You get to wrestle with your inner voices. When you're doing a really difficult workout, there's this voice. I refer to him as Lazy Bill. I think what he does is he lives in a back bedroom of my mind where he plays video games all day long. But when he sees me actually doing something, he feels threatened. So he comes out and tries to undermine what I'm doing. So I'm doing a hard workout. I'm doing interval training, and he creeps out and says, Bill, if you only slowed down, it would feel so good. Oh, and if you stopped altogether, oh, think of how good that would feel. And so for me, sometimes he wins. He's very seductive. But for me, it's a chance to wrestle with him. And I knock him to the ground and I pummel him into unconsciousness. And eventually he recovers and slinks back into the bedroom. But in the meantime, chalk one up for me. Because a lot of people, that's the voice that controls them. That's the voice that dictates what they're going to do with their life. And they've only got one life to live. And you can't waste it, listening to these voices in your head. You've got to take control of your life.
You actually answered my last question there, Bill. That was the last question I was going to ask, because in the Guide to the Good Life, you talked about the inner enemy, and that's what you were speaking there just now.
Okay.
My experience with that is very similar. I'm not a rower, but I'm a runner. And
Good.
And when you spoke about turning up to races with that inner voice telling you, well, mine would say, "Oh, you don't need to race today. Just chill out. Why are you running? What's the point in running?" You know, and it's like combating that and fighting against that. And then when you do, you feel excellent. You know, I describe the experience when I do a race as a hangover in reverse,
Yep.
because the joy of, you know, the inner bliss I get after it. You know, I go through pain and torment.
Yep.
But after it, I feel absolutely remarkable. And I'm sure you get the same experience with it.
Yeah, I call it the 4-minute flu.
Yeah.
1,000 meter
I like
sprints, and in a boat it takes about 4 minutes to do, and you start out just feeling so good, and by the time you're done, you're literally speechless. You're panting so hard you can't talk, and you feel absolutely miserable. You know, give yourself 10 or 15 minutes and you're back. But why would any sensible human do such a thing? It's part of Stoic training.
Yeah, absolutely. And you use the term tranquility a lot in the book, and I think the tranquil experience you get from that is like second to none.
Yep.
You know,
Yep.
absolutely. So that's been excellent, Bill. This has been a fantastic interview. Colin, do you like to add anything? Because I've got no more questions here. Would you like to say anything?
Can I
Yeah,
add
of
one
course.
thing here? And
Yep,
that
of course
is,
you can,
you
Bill.
talked about Stoic Week, and Stoic Week is going to be capped by the Stoicon convention, which is going to be virtual this year.
Yeah.
I'm
Signed
going
up
to
for
be the keynote speaker, and I'll be covering some of this ground as well. But I'll be doing other things in my talk.
Mhm.
Great.
That's
I've got my
brilliant, Bill.
ticket. Have you got your ticket, Bob?
I've got my ticket. You put my donation
Okay.
in. It's a very low
Good.
donation, but
Okay.
I'll maybe add a wee bit on the day.
Okay.
No, I'm not. I'm definitely in. I'm in. But Bill, is it okay if I see Patricia's on? Is it all right to take a question from one of our guests if she wants
Sure.
to ask you one?
Sure.
Yeah. Patricia, would you like to come on with a question for Bill?
Hi. No, it's been a wonderful talk, and I've got lots to think about. Thanks
Good.
very, very much. It was really great. And I
Oh.
have got my ticket.
Okay. Thanks for listening. And you know, there's a sense in which what you're listening to is the ancient Stoics. I'm merely the messenger. So I'm doing my best to deliver the message.
Great. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Have you got anything to add, Colin?
Yeah, just a shout out to a listener who contacted us on Facebook
Yeah, I've got a
earlier
couple
this
shout outs
evening.
too. Yeah, which one you go?
Ross Sherry. Thanks for listening to us, Ross. Hope you continue to do so.
Yeah, I've got a couple of shout outs for some listeners too. I've got Erin Kilpatrick, I've got Martin Glancy, and I've got Vincent Carroll who says, keep on coming up with a good work, boys. So excellent stuff, man. Really, really good. We're starting to get there. We're starting to get a message out there, so that's good. See, before we finish up, Bill, can we just ask a quick question for our listeners? Could you tell us anywhere they could contact you?
William B, as in boy, Irvine, williambirvine.com is my website, and has a list of, there's stuff to read. It's got a list of talks I've given. It's got a list of talks I'm going to be giving, and then the books I've done, and so on. So that's it's one place to reach me. And I do make a very, I think I'm pretty good at responding to, you can leave messages there, and I'm pretty good at responding to those messages. Now, if you send me snail mail, man, you know, I have to find a stamp, and I have to find an envelope, but if you contact me on my website, I'll get back to you.
Oh, and I'll vouch for that. You were very quick at replying to me as well, so thanks a lot for that, Bill.
Sure.
So I think that's us. I think we'll finish at that. Thanks for the listeners for listening in. Also, once again, a massive thank you to Bill Irvine. Cracking. Really, really enjoyed that tonight. Do you want to finish up with anything, Colin?
Just another thank you. We appreciate the time that you've given for us, and we'll see our listeners in a couple of weeks for, I think we're doing a Stoic Week podcast. Is that right? Is that right, Bob?
Yeah, I think we're going to do a kind of Stoic Week podcast, maybe a couple of panel members on. So, yeah, tune in, guys. Looking forward to it. And StoiCon's coming up in the next few weeks. So, get your ticket if you've not already got it. Brilliant.
Bye-bye.
So, thank everybody. Have a good night. And I'll see you all
Right.
soon. Okay, thank you. Thanks
Thank
again.
you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Cheerio.
Bye.
Cheerio.